The knock came at exactly 11 p.m. Not loud, not rushed, just firm enough to feel deliberate, like someone who knew they would be heard. Niall froze in the middle of her living room, the blue glow of the television flickering across the walls, illuminating a space that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The house had been quiet all evening. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in when you trust that everything is exactly where it should be. Her husband was supposed to be out of town. A short business trip, he'd said that morning, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, promising he'd be back before the weekend. She had watched him leave with the same calm certainty she always carried, because trusting him had never felt like a risk. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that questioning them didn't even cross your mind? Niall stood there for a moment, listening. No second knock followed. Whoever stood on the other side of the door wasn't in a hurry, but they weren't leaving either. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Before we go any further, take a second. If you believe love, trust, and honesty still matter, subscribe to this channel. These stories aren't just about what happens to people. They're about what we can learn from them. Niall wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and walked toward the door, each step louder than it should have been in a house this still. When she opened it, she found her neighbor standing there. Rowan Hale. He lived 3 houses down. Quiet, polite, the kind of man who waved but never lingered. Tonight, though, something was different. His shoulders were tense. His eyes held a hesitation that didn't belong to casual conversation. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I know it's late." Niall forced a small smile. "Is everything okay?" Rowan glanced past her, as if checking whether anyone else was listening, then leaned in just enough that his voice dropped to a whisper. "Your billionaire husband is at my house." The words didn't make sense at first. They didn't crash. They didn't explode. They simply hovered between them, unreal, misplaced, like a sentence meant for another woman's life. Niall blinked once. "That's not possible." Rowan didn't argue. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't add drama. He simply stepped slightly to the side, giving the truth room to exist. "I didn't know how else to tell you. If this were your life, what would you feel first? Anger or confusion?" Niall's chest tightened, not with rage, not yet, but with something far more unsettling. Her husband had never mentioned Rowan, never mentioned being anywhere near their quiet street tonight. And yet the certainty in Rowan's eyes left no space for misunderstanding. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. Rowan exhaled slowly. "That's what I don't know." And in that moment, standing at her open door with the night pressing in around her, Niall realized something she had never considered before. Sometimes love doesn't break with noise. Sometimes it fractures quietly, when the truth arrives before the explanation. Stay with this, Tori, because what Niall is about to discover isn't just where her husband went that night. It's what happens to love when silence becomes a habit. Niall didn't answer Rowan right away. The night air felt heavier now, as if it had shifted the moment the words were spoken. Somewhere down the street, a car passed, its headlights briefly sweeping across the houses before disappearing again. Life, apparently, was continuing as normal. Hers wasn't. She stepped back instinctively, fingers tightening around the edge of the door. "Are you sure?" she asked, not because she doubted him, but because her mind was searching for an easier explanation. A mistake, a misunderstanding, anything that didn't require her world to tilt. Rowan nodded once. "I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't." He didn't say more. That was what unsettled her the most. He wasn't trying to convince her. He wasn't filling the silence with guesses or opinions. He was simply holding the truth out in the open and letting her decide what to do with it. Niall glanced over her shoulder, back into the living room. The television was still on. An actress laughing at something that no longer felt relevant. Earlier that evening, Niall had folded laundry on the couch, thinking about what she'd cook when Calder returned. She had even smiled to herself, imagining how tired he would look, how she'd tease him for working too hard. Trust had a way of softening everything. "Why did he come to you?" Niall asked quietly. Rowan hesitated. He knocked, said he needed a place to sit for a moment. "I didn't know who he was at first. And now," Rowan's gaze didn't waver. "Now I know he's a man who looks like he's carrying more than he can hold." That answer didn't comfort her the way it might have earlier in her life. Once, she would have rushed to Calder's side without hesitation, ready to absorb whatever weight he brought home. Love had trained her to be understanding, to be patient, to believe that silence was just another form of strength. But standing there now, she felt the cost of that belief. "Can you show me?" she asked. Rowan stepped aside, without question. They walked together down the street, their footsteps unhurried, but heavy. The houses around them were dark, settled into sleep. This neighborhood had always felt safe to Niall, predictable, quiet, almost invisible to the larger world Calder belonged to. She realized, as they walked, how rarely Calder actually fit into this space. He loved the house. He loved the idea of peace. But he carried the rest of his life with him wherever he went. Meetings, expectations, decisions that affected people Niall would never meet. She had learned not to ask too many questions, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't want to compete with a world that demanded so much from him. Sometimes, without meaning to, love learns to stay silent. Rowan stopped at his front door and turned to her. "You don't have to come in," he said. "I can ask him to leave." Niall shook her head. "No. If I turn away now, I'll keep doing it." The words surprised her with their firmness. She realized then that this moment wasn't only about Calder. It about her, about how often she chose comfort over clarity, about how easy it had been to assume that trust meant never questioning, never pressing, never asking for more than what was offered. Rowan opened the door. Calder stood near the window, his back half turned, his jacket draped over the arm of a chair. The light from the lamp cast long shadows across the room, outlining a man who looked familiar and somehow distant at the same time. When he turned and saw her, the surprise on his face was immediate. "Niel!" He said her name the way he always did, softly, carefully, but tonight it sounded unfinished. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Niel took him in slowly. His sleeves were rolled up, just as they were when he was thinking too hard. His hair was slightly out of place. He looked tired, not the polished exhaustion he carried home from events or meetings, but a deeper kind, the kind that came from holding things in for too long. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her, too. Calder glanced at Rowan, then back at her. "I needed a quiet place." Rowan stiffened slightly. "You didn't mention you were married." Calder's jaw tightened, not defensively, but with something closer to regret. "I didn't think it mattered." Niel felt the words settle in her chest, not like a blow, but like a crack. Small, precise, easy to ignore. If she chose to, "It matters to me," she said. Calder took a step toward her and stopped, as if unsure whether he was still allowed. "Please," he said, "let me explain." Niel studied him for a long moment. This, the man she loved, the man who once stayed up all night, helping her repaint a community center, just because she'd mentioned it mattered to her. The man who listened, really listened, when she spoke, or at least he used to. She nodded once, then explained. They sat on Rowan's couch, a careful distance between them. Rowan busied himself in the kitchen, giving them space without being asked. The room felt too quiet again, but this time the silence was shared. Calder ran a hand over his face. "I didn't want to come home like this," he said. "Not carrying what I'm carrying." Niel folded her hands together. "You don't get to decide what I can carry." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something softened in his expression. "I know. I forgot." The honesty in that admission unsettled her more than excuses would have. "I've been disappearing," he continued. "Not physically, emotionally. I thought if I kept the hard parts away from you, I could protect what we have." "That's not protection," Niel said gently. "That's distance." Calder swallowed. "I didn't realize how far I'd gone until I was standing in a stranger's house, wishing I could breathe." The word lingered. Breathe. Niel leaned back slightly, absorbing it. She thought of all the times she'd sensed something was wrong and told herself it was nothing. Of all the evenings she'd chosen not to ask how deep his exhaustion went, afraid of what the answer might demand of her. Love, she was learning, wasn't just about patience. It was about presence. Rowan appeared briefly, setting tea on the table. "I'll give you two some time," he said, then quietly stepped away. When the door closed, Niel reached for Calder's hand, not to comfort him, not to excuse him, but to anchor the moment. "I still love you," he said. I know, she replied, but love doesn't survive on silence. Calder nodded slowly. Then don't let me hide anymore. Niel met his eyes. Then don't ask me to. And in that quiet agreement, spoken without promises, without grand declarations, something shifted. Not fixed, not solved, but seen. For the first time in a long while, they weren't protecting each other from the truth. They were standing in it together. If this moment made you pause, if you've ever trusted someone without asking the hard questions, don't scroll away. Like this video, if you believe love deserves honesty. Comment below. What would you have done after that knock at 11 p.m.? And subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, because the next chapter reveals why silence can be more dangerous than betrayal. The truth is just beginning. Niel didn't sleep that night, even after she and Calder returned home, even after the lights were turned off and the house settled back into its familiar quiet. Her mind refused to rest. Calder lay beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, yet far enough to remind her that something between them had shifted. Not broken, but exposed. She stared at the ceiling, replaying the evening. Not the knock itself, but the moment just before it. The moment she had believed everything was fine, simply because she hadn't questioned it. Calder turned toward her at some point, his voice low. "I'm here." She nodded in the dark. "I know." And that, she realized, was the problem. Knowing someone was present wasn't the same as feeling them there. Morning came softly. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, tracing familiar patterns across the bedroom walls. Calder was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, his phone untouched in his hand. That alone told her something had changed. Normally, his mornings were filled with messages, updates, demands waiting to be answered. Today, he seemed reluctant to let the world back in. "I canceled my flight," he said quietly. Niel sat up. "Your meetings? They'll survive," he replied. "We two talk." They moved to the kitchen, the simple routines of the morning suddenly heavy with meaning. Coffee brewed, cups clinked. The ordinary insisted on continuing, even as something extraordinary had cracked open between them. Calder leaned against the counter. "I didn't go to Rowan's house because of him," he said. "I went because I didn't trust myself to explain things without running away." Niel studied his face. "Running from what?" "My own silence," he admitted. "I've been choosing what's easier instead of what's honest." That sentence stayed with her. How many times had she done the same? She had grown skilled at reading Calder's moods without naming them, at filling the gaps he left with understanding instead of questions, at convincing herself that love meant endurance rather than engagement. "What scared you about telling me?" she asked. Calder hesitated. "That you'd see how tired I am. That you'd realize I'm not as steady as I pretend to be." Niel reached across the counter, resting her hand over his. "I married you. You were human." He looked at her then, really looked at her, And for the first time in a long while, she saw relief instead of resolve. Later that morning, Niel found herself standing by the front window, watching Rowan step out of his house. He paused when he saw her and lifted a hand in greeting. Unsure, she surprised herself by stepping outside. "Thank you," she said. When he approached, Rowan shook his head slightly. "I wasn't sure if I did the right thing." "You did," Niel replied. "Truth is rarely comfortable, but it's always necessary." Rowan smiled faintly. "I've learned that the quiet way." As he walked away, Niel realized something important. People who value honesty don't force it. They offer it and let others choose. That afternoon, Calder suggested they go for a walk. Not to escape, not to distract, but to talk without walls around them. They walked slowly, side by side, not touching at first. The neighborhood felt different now, less like a hiding place, and more like a shared space they both belonged to. "I've been afraid of disappointing you," Calder said. "And in trying to avoid that, I ended up disappointing us." Niel exhaled. "I've been afraid of asking for more. I didn't want to seem ungrateful." They stopped walking and turned toward each other. "Love isn't gratitude," Calder said. "It's participation." She smiled softly. "Then let's participate again." He reached for her hand this time, and she let him. The touch wasn't urgent, wasn't dramatic. It was intentional. That night, when they returned home, the house felt different. Not lighter, but truer. They cooked together, talked longer than usual, and for the first time in months, Calder didn't check his phone once. Romance returned quietly, a shared glance across the table, a laugh that lingered, a closeness that came from choosing presence instead of habit. Niel rested her head against his shoulder later, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "I don't need perfection," she said. "I need honesty." Calder pressed a kiss to her hair. "Then I'll stop pretending." And in that moment, Niel understood something that would stay with her long after the night faded. Love doesn't grow through avoidance. It grows through courage, the courage to speak, to listen, and to stay. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar, almost fragile. Calder stayed home more, not dramatically, not announced. He was simply there, in the mornings, in the evenings, at the table when Niel cooked, on the couch when she read. Presence, she was learning, wasn't loud. It revealed itself quietly, through consistency. Still, something remained unresolved. Not the truth. They had spoken that aloud. But the reason the truth had waited so long. On the fourth evening after the knock, Niel brought it up. They were sitting on the back porch, the air warm, cicadas humming in the distance. Calder stared out at the darkening sky, his hands wrapped loosely around a mug he'd long stopped drinking from. "You said Rowan's house felt safe. Niall began. Why? Calder didn't answer. Right away. When everything I touch turns into responsibility, he finally said, I forget how to be just a person. She looked at him, and with me, with you, he said carefully. I didn't want to fail. Niall felt the weight of that admission settle between them. You didn't fail, she said. You hid. Calder nodded, and hiding felt easier than disappointing you. That was when Niall understood something she hadn't before. Sometimes people don't pull away because they care less, but because they care so much they're afraid to be seen imperfectly. That night, she reached for him. First, the closeness was gentle, familiar, not driven by urgency, but by reassurance. Their foreheads touched. Calder's breath slowed, as if he'd finally allowed himself to stop bracing. Romance didn't return as passion first. It returned as safety. The next morning, Calder dressed differently, not in the tailored clothes that signaled authority, but in simple jeans and a soft shirt Niall hadn't seen him wear in years. He noticed her noticing and smiled faintly. I used to wear this when I was figuring things out, he said. Niall smiled back. You still are. They laughed quietly, and for a moment, the weight lifted. Later that afternoon, Calder suggested visiting the community center where they had first met. Niall hesitated. Why now? Because I want to remember who I was before I learned how to hide, he said. The center hadn't changed much. Fresh paint covered old scars. Children's artwork lined the walls. The smell of cleaner and warm air carried memory with it. Calder stood still for a long moment, absorbing it. This is where I learned that success didn't come from control, he said. It came from showing up. Niall took his hand. Then don't forget that lesson again. As they left, Calder glanced at her. I don't want to be impressive anymore. I want to be honest. She squeezed his hand. That's more than enough. That evening, Rowan appeared again, not at their door, but across the street, watering his plants. He looked up, hesitated, then nodded. Calder walked over before Niall could stop him. I owe you an apology, Calder said. Rowan frowned slightly. For what? For putting you in the middle of something that wasn't yours, Calder replied. And for not being up front. Rowan considered him, then shrugged. You looked like a man who needed somewhere quiet to stand. I didn't need the full story. Calder nodded. I'm learning that silence has consequences. Rowan smiled faintly. It usually does. Niall watched them from the porch, realizing something important. Honesty doesn't just repair relationships. It prevents innocent people from carrying weight that was never meant for them. That night, Calder and Niall talked longer than they had in years. Not about schedules. Not about plans. But, fears. Calder admitted he'd begun measuring his worth by how much he could handle alone. Niel admitted she'd learned to minimize her needs, to keep peace. Neither of them liked what they heard, but both felt relief in finally saying it. Romance deepened in the quiet aftermath. A shared shower of laughter, a hand resting at the small of her back, a kiss that lingered because no one was rushing away. Niel rested her head against his chest. Later, listening to his heartbeat. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. When it gets heavy again," she said. "Don't disappear. Knock." Calder smiled against her hair. At any hour. And for the first time since that night at 11 p.m., Niel slept deeply, knowing that love, when chosen daily, didn't need secrets to survive. The community center smelled like fresh paint and dust the first day Niel met Calder. She remembered it clearly, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary in a way her life hadn't been before. The building was old, tucked between a laundromat and a closed-down grocery store, its walls marked by time and effort. Niel had volunteered there every weekend for nearly a year, helping repaint classrooms, organize donated books, and fix things no one else noticed until they stopped working. Calder arrived late. He stood just inside the doorway, hesitating, as if unsure whether he belonged there. His shirt was too clean, his shoes untouched by dust, and his expression carried a polite uncertainty that made Niel smile before she even spoke to him. "You look lost," she said, handing him a paintbrush. He laughed softly. "I was hoping no one would notice." She tilted her head. "You're holding the wrong end." He glanced down, then back up at her, amused. "That explains a lot. That how it began. Not with intention, not with attraction announced or declared. Just two people sharing a task, learning each other slowly." Calder stayed longer than he planned that day. And the next, the one after that. He asked questions about the center, about the neighborhood, about why Niel volunteered when she worked long hours elsewhere. She noticed how carefully he listened, how he remembered small things she mentioned and brought them up later. When he spoke, he never tried to impress her. He spoke as if he didn't need to. Niel found herself looking for him each weekend without realizing it. Romance didn't arrive dramatically. It unfolded. They talked while cleaning brushes. They sat on the steps outside during breaks, sharing bottled water and quiet laughter. Calder admitted he'd never done anything like this before. Niel admitted she preferred places where effort mattered more than titles. "What do you do?" she finally asked him one afternoon. He hesitated. "I build things." She smiled. "Do we?" That answer stayed with him. Weeks passed before Calder told her the truth. By then, they were already something, walking together after volunteer shifts, lingering too long in conversations neither wanted to end. He held doors for her without making a show of it. She noticed how he slowed his pace to match hers, how his attention never wandered when she spoke. One evening, sitting on the hood of his car under fading light, Calder finally spoke. "There's something I should tell you." Niel waited, calm. "I'm not just building things, he said. I run them. She studied his face. That's not what you're afraid to say. He exhaled. I have money, more than most people, and it changes how people see you. Niall considered this quietly. Is that all? He blinked. You're not surprised? I'm surprised you thought it would matter more than how you treat people, she replied. That was the moment Calder realized something he hadn't known before. Some people don't love what you provide. They love who you are when nothing is required. From then on, he told her everything, not as a confession, but as an invitation. She listened, not dazzled, not intimidated, just present. Their love deepened with intention. Calder learned Niall needed honesty, more than reassurance. Niall learned Calder carried responsibility like armor and needed permission to set it down. Intimacy followed naturally. A hand finding another during long walks. A shared silence that didn't need filling. A kiss that arrived slowly, without urgency, as if both of them understood that rushing would cheapen what they were building. When Calder asked her to marry him, he did it without spectacle. I can promise you effort, he said, and truth, and showing up. Niall smiled through tears. That's all I've ever wanted. Remembering this now, sitting across from Calder years later, Niall felt the weight of how far they had drifted, not from love, but from those early promises. Calder looked at her, as if sensing her thoughts. I forgot that version of myself, he admitted. Somewhere along the way, success taught me to measure everything. Niall reached for his hand. Love can't be measured. He squeezed her fingers gently. Then I want to relearn it. That night, they held each other with the same careful closeness they once had. No urgency, no performance. Just two people choosing to be present again. Romance didn't need grand gestures. It needed remembrance. And as Niall rested against Calder's chest, she realized something quietly powerful. Love doesn't disappear when life becomes complicated. It fades when we stop protecting it with honesty. Love didn't disappear all at once. That was the part Niall struggled to explain later, even to herself. There was no single argument, no defining betrayal, no moment where everything shattered. Instead, love slowly learned how to be quiet. At first, it felt harmless. Calder's work expanded, the way storms do, gradually, then suddenly. Meetings replaced dinners, calls interrupted conversations. Promises were kept, just later than expected. Niall adjusted without complaint, telling herself this was what partnership looked like: flexibility, patience, understanding. She had loved Calder when he had nothing but ideas and energy. Loving him now, successful, respected, surrounded by expectation, felt like a continuation of that same promise. But somewhere along the way, effort began turning into endurance. Calder was still kind, still attentive in bursts. He never raised his voice, never dismissed her outright, yet his presence became divided, as though his body arrived home while his mind lingered elsewhere. Niall learned to read the signs. The way he nodded without quite listening. The way his phone stayed face up on the table. The way silence crept into conversations that once flowed. She told herself not to take it personally. That was the first compromise. Calder noticed the change, too, though he didn't know how to name it. Success had trained him to be decisive, efficient, controlled. In his world, hesitation cost money. Vulnerability invited scrutiny. He learned to manage pressure by containing it, believing that if he held everything together tightly enough, nothing would spill. At home, that habit followed him. When Niel asked how his day went, he gave summaries instead of truths. When exhaustion crept in, he brushed it off with humor. He told himself he was protecting her, shielding her from stress she didn't need to carry. But protection, when it excludes honesty, becomes isolation. Some nights, Calder sat beside Niel on the couch while she read, her legs tucked under her, the soft glow of a lamp warming the room. He watched her turn pages, her brow furrowing in concentration, and felt an ache he couldn't explain. He missed her, not physically, she was right there, but emotionally, as if an invisible distance had grown between them. Instead of closing it, he worked longer. Niel began shrinking in small ways. She stopped asking certain questions. She delayed conversations that felt inconvenient. She told herself she didn't want to add pressure. Love, she believed, was about making things easier for the person you cared about. But ease came at a cost. The more she minimized her needs, the more invisible they became, even to herself. She started filling her time with routines, convincing herself she was content. It wasn't unhappiness she felt, exactly. It was absence. Romance didn't vanish. It softened into habit. Goodnight kisses became brief. Laughter came less often. Touch remained, but without intention. Neither of them noticed at first. They were too busy being responsible. That was the danger. The first real warning came one evening when Calder missed their anniversary. Not completely. He remembered late, rushed home with flowers and apologies, his sincerity genuine. Niel smiled, hugged him, told him it was fine. And it was. But later that night, lying awake beside him, she stared at the ceiling and realized something unsettling. She had been relieved not to make it a big deal. Relief should never replace desire. Calder sensed her distance, but misread it. He thought she was adapting, growing stronger, becoming independent. He admired her for it, not realizing she was quietly stepping back to keep the peace. Both of them were trying to protect the relationship. Neither of them was protecting connection. Weeks turned into months. Calder's world demanded more visibility, more appearances, more leadership. He wore confidence like a second skin, admired by people who assumed success equaled certainty. At home, he felt hollow. Some nights, he stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching Niel sleep, wondering when he'd stop telling her everything. He told himself he'd fix it when things slowed down. They never did. That was when the silence grew heavy. Not angry, not cold, just unspoken. And silence, left unchecked, has a way of convincing people they're alone, even when they're loved. Looking back, Niall would later realize this was the chapter where everything could have changed sooner. A conversation could have interrupted the drift. A question could have bridged the distance. An admission could have invited honesty back in. But neither of them spoke, because love felt stable enough to survive neglect. They were wrong, and the night of the knock, the night truth finally arrived, had been building long before anyone stood at the door. If this chapter feels familiar, if you've ever noticed love grow quiet instead of loud, pause for a moment. Like this video, if you believe relationships need communication, not just commitment. Comment below. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace? And did it help or hurt? And subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, because the next chapter reveals why silence doesn't protect love. It tests it. The turning point is coming. Calder had always believed he was strong because he could endure pressure, endure expectation, endure the weight of being needed by everyone. What he hadn't understood was how endurance, when unshared, slowly becomes isolation. The night he didn't come home had begun like many others. Meetings stretched longer than planned. Conversations demanded answers he didn't yet have. Every decision carried consequences that reached far beyond him. By the time he stepped outside into the cool air, his phone buzzed with messages he couldn't bring himself to open. He sat in his car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, the city lights blurring in front of him. He could go home, or he could breathe. That was when Rowan's house appeared in his mind. Not because of the man himself, but because of what the house represented. Quiet, ordinary, a place untouched by expectations. Calder told himself it would only be for a moment. Niall listened as Calder spoke, her expression calm but attentive. They were back in their living room now, days removed from that night, but still close enough to feel its weight. The house was dim, lit by a single lamp. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. I didn't trust myself to explain how tired I was, Calder admitted. I thought if I said it out loud, I'd sound ungrateful. Niall folded her legs beneath her. Tired doesn't mean ungrateful. I know that now, he said. But I didn't. Then he explained how responsibility had reshaped his identity, how people stopped asking how he felt and started assuming he could handle everything, how he'd begun believing it himself. At Rowan's house, he continued, no one expected anything from me. I wasn't a decision maker. I was just there. Niall nodded slowly. And with me, Calder hesitated. With you, I felt like I had to be steady. Like falling apart would cost me your trust. Niall leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. You don't lose trust by being human, she said gently. You lose it by disappearing. The words landed without accusation. That was what made them powerful. Romance, in that moment, didn't look like closeness. It looked like courage. Calder reached for her hand, his grip uncertain. I didn't come home because I didn't know how to bring the truth with me. Niall let him hold her hand, but didn't squeeze back yet. Truth belongs at home, she said, even when it's heavy. He nodded, eyes lowered. I see that now. She took a breath, choosing honesty herself. I didn't ask because I was afraid you'd need more than I had to give. Calder looked up sharply. You don't get to decide that for me. She smiled, faintly. Then we've both been doing the same thing. They sat with that realization for a while. Later, when the rain slowed and the house grew quieter, they moved closer. Not because the conversation demanded it, but because they felt safer. Calder rested his forehead against hers, breathing slowly. I don't want to escape anymore, he said. I want to come home, even when I don't feel like myself. Niall closed her eyes. Then let me see you. That was intimacy, not physical urgency, but emotional permission. Romance deepened in the aftermath. A hand resting on back. A shared stillness. A kiss that carried reassurance instead of apology. Niall realized then that love doesn't require strength at all times. It requires truth. In the days that followed, Calder began making small changes. Not declarations, not promises, actions. He left work earlier twice that week. He told Niall when he felt overwhelmed instead of retreating. When decisions weighed on him, he spoke them aloud, even when he didn't have answers. Niall noticed the difference immediately, not because everything felt perfect, but because everything felt real. She, too, changed. She spoke sooner, asked questions, even when they felt inconvenient. She stopped cushioning her words to protect him from discomfort. What emerged wasn't conflict. It was clarity. One evening, standing together in the kitchen, Niall watched Calder chop vegetables clumsily, smiling at his concentration. You're quieter lately, she said. He laughed softly. I'm listening more. She leaned against the counter. Don't stop. He met her gaze. Whoa, and in that simple exchange, Niall understood something deeply. Love doesn't collapse under honesty. It strengthens. The night Calder didn't come home wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the moment they learned what love required to survive. Rebuilding didn't arrive with a dramatic moment. It came quietly, in decisions that looked ordinary from the outside, but carried weight beneath the surface. Calder didn't announce his intentions. Niall didn't demand change. They simply began choosing each other again, deliberately, consistently, without spectacle. It started with time. Calder began leaving space in his schedule instead of filling every hour. He protected evenings the way he once protected meetings. When calls came in late, he let them wait. Not always, but often enough that Niel noticed. Presence, she learned, was an act of prioritization. They talked more, not just about what happened during the day, but about how it felt. Calder admitted when pressure followed him home. Niel admitted when she felt overlooked. They resisted the urge to smooth things over too quickly, allowing discomfort to exist long enough to be understood. Romance returned through intention, not urgency, not obligation, but awareness. Calder brushed Niel's hair from her face when she spoke. She rested her hand on his arm when he grew quiet. Their touch carried meaning again, small reminders that they were seen. One evening, Calder surprised her, not with a gift or a grand plan, but with a question. "What do want back?" he asked. Niel looked up from her book. "What do you mean?" "In us," he said. "What did we lose that you miss most?" She considered this carefully. "Conversation without distraction," she said. "Time that isn't borrowed from something else." Calder nodded. "Then let's start there." They began setting aside one evening each week, with no interruptions, no phones, no work talk unless invited. At first, the silence felt awkward, like a language they hadn't spoken in a while. Then it softened. They laughed again, shared memories, talked about fears that had gone unspoken for years. Calder admitted he sometimes measured his worth by how indispensable he felt. Niel admitted she'd mistaken patience for self-erasure. Neither judged the other. That the difference. Intimacy deepened naturally. A slow dance in the living room, to music playing softly from a speaker. Calder's hand resting at her waist, Niel's head against his shoulder. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Love felt unhurried again. Later, as they sat together on the couch, Niel traced patterns on Calder's palm. "I don't need you to be everything," she said. "I need you to be real." Calder kissed her fingers gently. "Then I'll stop performing." That night, closeness came easily. Not rushed, not dramatic, but warm and steady. Romance didn't demand attention. It simply existed. They spoke about boundaries next. Not rules, but respect. Calder committed to sharing when work threatened to overtake him. Niel committed to speaking when she felt herself pulling away. They agreed that silence would no longer be mistaken for strength. Education, Niel realized, wasn't just learned from books or advice. It was learned through experience, through choosing differently when old patterns resurfaced. Rowan noticed the change before anyone else. One afternoon, he passed them walking together, laughing at something small. He nodded, pleased. Niel caught his eye. "Thank you," she said again. Rowan smiled. "Looks like you didn't need me, after all." She shook her head. "We needed honesty. You just delivered it." As he walked away, Niel understood something clearly. Sometimes the people who intervene in our lives aren't meant to stay. They're meant to point us back to what matters. That night, as Niel and Calder prepared for bed, Calder paused in the doorway. "I used to think choosing you once was enough," he said. "I know better now." Niel smiled softly. "Love isn't a decision you make once. It's a decision you renew." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her with the same care he had when they first fell in love. And in that moment, Niel felt something settle into place. Not certainty, not perfection, but commitment. The kind that grows stronger because it's chosen daily. Change didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like light returning to a room that had been dimmed for too long. There was no announcement, no dramatic shift that made everything suddenly easy. Instead, there were patterns, new ones, forming where old habits used to live. Calder began declining meetings, not recklessly, not defiantly, but deliberately. He chose which responsibilities truly required his attention and which had only demanded it out of habit. The world did not collapse when he stepped back. If anything, it adjusted. Niel noticed first in the mornings. Calder lingered longer over breakfast, listening instead of rushing. He asked about her day, not as a courtesy, but with curiosity. When she spoke, he stayed present, his phone nowhere in sight. These were small changes, but small changes, repeated, reshape relationships. Niel changed, too. She stopped waiting for the right moment to speak. When something unsettled her, she said so, calmly, clearly, without apology. She no longer softened her words to protect Calder from discomfort. Instead, she trusted that honesty was a form of care. One afternoon, as they worked in the garden together, she spoke up. "I miss our conversations when they wander," she said, "when they don't need to end anywhere." Calder wiped his hands on his jeans. "Then let's wander more." They sat on the grass afterward, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. Dreams they'd delayed, ideas they'd shelved, questions they hadn't asked yet. Romance lived in those moments. Not dramatic, but grounded. A shared smile. A shoulder leaned into another. A warmth that didn't need intensity to feel alive. The house itself felt different. Not larger, not brighter, more honest. Rooms once filled with quiet now carried conversation. Laughter returned without effort. Even disagreements felt healthier, shorter, clearer, resolved without avoidance. One evening, Niel watched Calder fold laundry without being asked. She smiled, amused. "What?" he asked. "You're present," she said. "It shows." Calder nodded thoughtfully. "I didn't realize how often I was somewhere else." Education, she thought, wasn't always taught. Sometimes it was realized. Rowan faded naturally from their story, not because he was pushed away, but because his role had been fulfilled. They waved when they passed. A exchanged pleasantries. Nothing more was needed. Niel appreciated that. Some people enter your life not to stay, but to remind you of something you've forgotten. One night, lying together in bed, Niel traced slow circles on Calder's chest. "Do you ever worry we'll slip back?" she asked. Calder considered this. "I worry we'll forget why we chose to change." She nodded. "Then let's remember." They agreed to keep choosing presence over performance, conversation over assumption, truth over comfort. Romance deepened in the safety of that promise. A kiss that lingered without urgency. A closeness that felt secure, not fragile. A love no longer driven by fear of loss. In the quiet weeks that followed, Niel realized something profound. Change that lasts isn't loud. It's consistent. Calder wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He was simply living differently. And she wasn't holding back to keep peace. She was participating fully. Together, they had created something stronger than before. Not because the storm never came, but because they learned how to face it side by side. Time had softened the edges of that night, not erased it, not diminished its weight, but given it shape. Niel found herself thinking about the knock less as an interruption and more as a turning point, a quiet moment that redirected everything that followed. Without it, she wondered how long she and Calder might have continued mistaking silence for stability. Some truths, she realized, don't arrive gently. They arrive when we're comfortable enough to ignore them. One afternoon, weeks later, Niel stood at the front door, staring at the wood where her hand had rested the night Rowan knocked. She remembered the way her heart had stilled, the way certainty had dissolved into questions. She smiled faintly. That door hadn't just opened to her neighbor. It had opened to herself. Calder joined her, slipping an arm around her waist, thinking about that night. "Yes," she said, "about how close we were to staying the same." He nodded. Change usually waits for discomfort. They stood there quietly, understanding what might have been lost had truth not insisted on being heard. Their relationship felt different now. Not perfect, but grounded. Calder no longer treated stress as something to manage alone. He spoke earlier, asked for space when he needed it, instead of disappearing. He learned that sharing weight didn't weaken him. It connected him. Niel no longer interpreted quiet as strength. She trusted her voice. She asked questions before assumptions took root. She understood that love required participation, not patience alone. Romance thrived in that mutual awareness, not through intensity, but through presence. A shared look across a crowded room, a hand squeezed during difficult conversations, a familiarity that felt chosen, not taken for granted. Rowan remained a quiet reminder, not a threat, not a catalyst anymore, just a symbol of the truth arriving when it had to. One evening, as Niel and Calder walked past his house, Rowan looked up from his garden and smiled. Calder nodded in return. Niel thought about how easily that moment could have turned into resentment or misunderstanding. Instead, it had become a bridge, one that led them back to each other. Education, she realized, often comes disguised as inconvenience. Later that night, sitting together on the porch, Niel spoke what she'd been holding for days. I used to think love failed when people made mistakes, she said. Now, I think it fails when people stop speaking. Calder leaned back, considering this. I used to think strength meant handling everything alone. She smiled. We both learned something. He took her hand. That's what makes it worth it. They watched the sky darken. Comfortable in the quiet, they now understood. As Niel rested her head against Calder's shoulder, she felt gratitude, not just for the love they shared, but for the lesson they had learned together. The whisper that night hadn't been an accusation. It had been an invitation to choose honesty, to choose courage, to choose each other again. The house felt settled again, not because everything was perfect, but because nothing important was being avoided anymore. Niel noticed it in the quiet moments, the kind that once felt heavy, but now felt peaceful. Silence had returned. But this time, it wasn't hiding anything. It was resting. Calder moved through the house differently now, slower, more aware. He no longer treated home as a place to recover from life, but as a place to live it. When work followed him through the door, he named it, instead of letting it linger unspoken. I'm carrying a lot today, he'd say, and Niel would nod, not rushing to fix it, not stepping back to make space, just staying present. That alone changed everything. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Niel asked a question she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Rowan hadn't knocked? Calder leaned back, thoughtful. Sometimes, and I think we would have stayed comfortable, he said, and slowly grown apart, while telling ourselves we were fine. Niel exhaled softly. Comfort is dangerous when it replaces honesty. He smiled at her. You've gotten wiser? Have you? Romance lived in that exchange. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but deeply rooted. They touched more now, not out of need, but out of connection. A hand finding another, a shoulder leaning in, a closeness that didn't ask for reassurance. Love had matured. They began talking about the future again, not in plans or promises, but in values. What kind of life they wanted, what kind of marriage they were protecting, what kind of people they hoped to remain. Calder admitted he no longer wanted to be admired at the cost of being known. Niel admitted she no longer wanted peace that required her silence. They laughed at how long it had taken them to learn something so simple. But learning, Niel realized, doesn't follow a schedule. It follows readiness. On a quiet afternoon, weeks later, Niel passed Rowan outside his house. They exchanged a warm greeting. Nothing more. As she walked on, she understood something clearly. Rowan hadn't changed their marriage. He had revealed where it was already fragile. Truth doesn't create cracks. It exposes them. What you do next determines everything. That night, Niel and Calder stood together at their front door, about to head out for a walk. Niel paused, her hand resting briefly on the doorframe. "This door," she said, smiling faintly. Calder nodded. "I know." They didn't need to say more. "Some doors close behind us. The others open us up. The difference lies in whether we choose to listen." Before the story ends, here are the lessons Niel and Calder learned. Lessons worth carrying forward. Love doesn't fail because people struggle. It fails when they struggle alone. Silence isn't strength when it hides fear. Honesty is. Success can provide comfort, but it cannot replace presence. And trust isn't maintained by assuming. It's maintained by communicating. Niel and Calder didn't survive because they avoided mistakes. They survived because they faced them together. If this story made you reflect, even for a moment, like this video to support stories that heal, not just entertain. Comment below what lessons spoke to you the most. And subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more stories about love, truth, and second chances. Because sometimes the moment that changes everything arrives as a quiet knock at 11 p.m. the end.